You know the feeling. You have been watching your tomato plants for weeks. You started them from seed, or maybe you picked out the nicest transplants at the nursery, and for a while, everything looks perfect. Green leaves, strong stems, little yellow flowers starting to open, and then one morning you walk out and something is off. Maybe the bottom leaves are turning yellow. Maybe there is a dark spot spreading on the fruit. Maybe the whole plant is wilting at noon, even though you watered it that morning. And you stand there thinking, what did I do wrong? I have been there more times than I care to admit. In my first 5 or 6 seasons, I lost plants to just about every problem you can imagine. Blossom end rot, early blight, wilt diseases that turned healthy plants into drooping skeletons in days, and I kept reading the same generic advice. Water consistently, give them sun, fertilize. But nobody was explaining why these problems were actually happening at a biological level. I was treating symptoms instead of causes, and the results showed it. In this video, I am going to walk you through the real reasons your tomatoes keep failing. And I do not mean the surface level stuff. I mean the actual science behind what is going wrong and how to fix it at the root. By the end of this, you are going to be able to look at a struggling tomato plant and diagnose the problem yourself instead of hoping the internet gives you the right answer. And the bonus tip at the end is a dead simple technique that dramatically cut my disease losses. But it took me years of stubbornness before I finally committed to it. Here is the thing most people miss about tomatoes. They are the single most popular home garden crop in America, and they're also one of the most demanding. Millions of gardeners grow them every year, and a huge number repeat the same mistakes season after season. Not because they are bad gardeners, but because they have never been shown the underlying biology. Once you learn to read what your tomato plant is actually telling you, you stop guessing and start solving. That is what this video is about. I am going to take you through this in the order it actually happens during a growing season. We will start with the decisions you make before anything goes in the ground, because some of the biggest mistakes happen right there. Then we will work through watering, pruning, feeding, disease, and planting timing. Every step builds on the last. I will explain the biology behind each problem, and we will finish with the most common troubleshooting scenarios and that bonus tip. Let us get into it. Determinate or indeterminate? That is the first decision, and getting it wrong affects everything that follows. Now, let me explain why this matters more than most people realize. A determinate tomato is genetically programmed to grow to a set size and stop. It puts out its fruit in a concentrated window. Most of the crop ripens within a couple of weeks, and then the plant is done. An indeterminate tomato has no built-in stop signal. It keeps growing and setting fruit until frost or disease kills it. That can mean 6 feet or more of growth over a season. These two types need completely different support, different pruning, and different expectations. Put an indeterminate in a small cage and expect it to stay contained, and you're going to have a mess by July. The second layer of this decision is variety selection, and this is where I made my most expensive early mistake. My third year growing tomatoes, I planted a gorgeous heirloom called Brandywine. Beautiful plant, incredible flavor reputation. It got absolutely destroyed by bacterial spot. The leaves looked like they had been hit with buckshot within 3 weeks. What I did not understand at the time was that heirloom varieties often carry zero disease resistance. The improved hybrid varieties you see in catalogues, the ones with letter codes like VFN or VFNT after the name, those letters represent specific diseases the plant has been bred to resist. V is for verticillium, F for fusarium, N for nematodes, T for tobacco mosaic virus. I was not reading those codes. I was picking tomatoes based on how pretty they looked in the catalogue photo. Once I started matching my variety selection to my actual growing conditions, my success rate jumped immediately. If you are in USDA zones 7 through 9, where humidity and heat create heavy disease pressure, those resistance codes matter enormously. That brings us to how you support that plant once it is in the ground. A full-grown indeterminate tomato can easily reach 6 feet tall and carry 4 to 8 pounds of fruit at any given time. That is the fact. Now, here is why your support system probably is not up to the job. Those conical wire cages you see at every garden centre are one of the worst options available. The cone shape means the widest support ring is at the top, but the heaviest growth is in the middle and lower sections. The wire gauge is too thin for the weight, and by midsummer, you end up with a cage that has tipped over or collapsed inward. I learned this my second season when a summer storm knocked over an entire row of caged tomatoes in about 10 minutes. The fruit that touched the ground started rotting within days. What you want instead is a cylindrical support, 18 to 24 inches in diameter. You can buy commercial cylindrical cages or make your own from cattle panel or concrete reinforcing wire bent into a cylinder and secured with zip ties. Stake it at least 8 to 10 inches deep so it does not tip. The cylinder shape gives even support from bottom to top, and the open structure allows airflow around the plant, which becomes critical for disease prevention. For row plantings, the Florida weave is hard to beat. Drive sturdy stakes every 2 to 3 plants, then weave twine between the stakes and stems, adding a new level every 8 to 10 inches as the plants grow. Excellent support at a fraction of the cost. Once you have your variety selected and your support in place, the next factor is the one that causes more tomato heartbreak than anything else: irregular watering. That is the number one cause of blossom end rot, and it is not what most people think it is. Let me explain the science, because this is one of the most misunderstood problems in home gardening. Blossom end rot shows up as a dark, sunken, leathery patch on the bottom of the fruit. Almost every source will tell you it is a calcium deficiency, and technically that is true. The cells at the blossom end are not getting enough calcium to build their cell walls, so the tissue collapses. But here is what most people get wrong. It is almost never a calcium problem in your soil. Most garden soils have plenty. The problem is transport. Calcium moves through the plant dissolved in water, pulled upward through the xylem by transpiration. When you water inconsistently, that transport system stutters. The plant cannot move calcium to the fruit fast enough, and you get rot. I added calcium to my soil for 3 seasons before I understood this. The fix was never in the soil. It was in my watering schedule. Water at the base of the plant, water in the morning, and keep the moisture level as consistent as you possibly can. I check by pushing a finger about an inch into the soil. If it feels dry at that depth, I water. If it is still damp, I wait. When I finally switched to drip irrigation on a timer, my blossom end rot almost completely disappeared. Not because the drip system was magic, but because it delivered water at the same rate, at the same time, every single day. There is a second watering mistake that is just as damaging: overhead watering. When you spray water over the top of a tomato plant, the foliage stays wet, creating the warm, humid conditions fungal pathogens love. And the water hits the soil and splashes back up onto the lower leaves, carrying soil-borne spores with it. That splash zone is ground zero for early blight and septoria leaf spot. How you deliver water matters just as much as how much you deliver. That connects directly to the next issue, because pruning is really about managing that same disease risk. 12 inches, that is the minimum clearance I keep between the soil surface and the lowest foliage on a mature tomato plant. Now let me explain why that number matters. Soil-borne fungal spores, particularly the ones that cause early blight and septoria leaf spot, spread to the plant through rain splash or irrigation splash. The spores land on the lowest leaves first, establish an infection, and then work their way up the plant over the course of the season. By removing that bottom 12 inches of foliage, you are creating a gap that the splash cannot easily bridge. It is not a guarantee, but it significantly slows the disease progression. I resisted doing this for a couple of seasons because it felt wrong to remove healthy green leaves. Then I tracked my disease timing in a notebook and realized that every single infection started on the bottom leaves. Every one. Once I started keeping that clearance, my plants stayed healthier deeper into the season. The other pruning mistake I see constantly is over-pruning suckers. Suckers are the shoots that emerge in the crotch between the main stem and a branch. On indeterminate tomatoes, removing some suckers directs more energy into fruit production and improves airflow. But strip every single sucker and you remove too much leaf canopy. The fruit that gets exposed to direct sun can develop sun-scald, pale, papery patches on the sun-facing side. I learned this the hard way. Now I leave the suckers above the first fruit cluster and only remove the ones below it and any growing inward. On determinate tomatoes, do not remove suckers at all and never top the plant. Determinates stop growing on their own, and topping them removes future fruit. If you are finding this helpful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new videos every week where I break down the science behind growing better food at home. It is free, and it means you will not miss the next one. All right, let us keep going. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. That is not an opinion. It is a measurable fact based on the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium they pull from the soil over a full growing season. But more fertilizer does not mean more tomatoes, and this is where a lot of gardeners get themselves into trouble. The science behind this is actually pretty simple. Nitrogen drives vegetative growth, leaves, stems, overall plant size. Phosphorus and potassium support flowering and fruit production. If you keep pushing heavy nitrogen once the plant has reached full size and started flowering, you are telling it to keep growing leaves instead of setting fruit. I did this my 4th season, side dressing with high nitrogen compost every 2 weeks. The plants were enormous. They were also producing almost no tomatoes. On the other end, under-fertilization shows up as pale or yellowing leaves, thin stems, and poor fruit set. The plant simply does not have enough fuel to do its job. My approach now is straightforward. A good dose of compost or balanced organic granular fertilizer in the planting hole at transplant time. A side dress of the same fertilizer about 6 to 8 weeks later when the plant is actively fruiting. And occasionally a liquid feed of fish or kelp emulsion if a plant looks like it needs a boost. That is it. I stopped chasing complicated fertilizer schedules years ago, and my results got better, not worse. That brings us to something most gardeners do not pay enough attention to until it is too late. 7 to 14 days. That is how long a fungal infection has typically been active on your tomato plant before you notice the first visible symptoms. Let me explain why that timeline matters. The 3 most common tomato diseases in home gardens are early blight, septoria leaf spot, and bacterial spot. Early blight starts on the lowest, oldest leaves as dark brown spots with concentric rings, almost like a target pattern. Septoria shows up as small circular spots with dark edges and tan or grey centres, usually covered with tiny black dots. Bacterial spot produces small, dark, water-soaked lesions that can appear on leaves, stems, and fruit. All 3 are present in the soil or on plant debris long before you see anything wrong. By the time you notice discoloured leaves, the pathogen has been active for 1 to 2 weeks and is already producing spores for the next wave of infection. The single most valuable habit I developed was inspecting the lower leaves of my tomato plants every 3 to 4 days, starting about 2 weeks after transplant. I flip leaves over, I look at the undersides, and I look for anything that does not match healthy green tissue. Catching an infection in its first week gives you a realistic chance of slowing it down with an organic copper fungicide or by removing affected leaves before the spores spread. Waiting until the disease is halfway up, the plant means you are managing damage, not preventing it. Once you have your feeding and disease monitoring dialed in, there is one more mistake that happens before any of that, and it is one of the most common: 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the minimum soil temperature your tomato roots need to function properly. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because almost every gardener I know has rushed transplants into the ground too early at least once. The excitement of spring is powerful, but soil warms up much slower than air. You can have a 75-degree afternoon while your soil at root depth is still in the mid-50s. At that temperature, tomato roots absorb water and nutrients so slowly that the plant stalls. It sits there looking stunned, and while it is sitting there with a weakened root system, it is vulnerable to every soil-borne pathogen in the bed. I lost an entire flat of transplants my second spring to a late frost that the forecast missed. 41 degrees at 4 in the morning. Everything was blackened by sunrise. After that, I bought a soil thermometer, and I do not plant until I get consistent readings of 60 degrees at 4 inches deep, measured in the morning when the soil is coolest. In USDA zones 6 and 7, that typically means waiting until mid to late May. In zones 8 and 9, you can often get there by mid-April. Plants that go in 2 weeks later into warm soil catch up to and often surpass early planted ones within a month because they establish roots so much faster. One more critical step that gets skipped constantly: hardening off. If transplants go straight from a grow light to full outdoor sun and wind, the shock can set them back a week or more. I spend 7 to 10 days gradually increasing outdoor exposure. First day, 1 hour of morning shade. By the end of the week, full sun all day. The transplants hit the ground, ready to grow instead of scrambling to recover. Now let me walk through the most common problems you're likely to see and what is actually causing them. Because once you know the science, the fix becomes obvious. Blossom end rot. Dark, sunken patch on the bottom of the fruit. I covered the science earlier. Inconsistent watering disrupts calcium transport. Consistent moisture and mulch are your fix. Yellowing leaves starting at the bottom of the plant and working upward. This is either early blight or nitrogen deficiency. And the way you tell them apart is the pattern. Blight produces distinct spots with ring patterns. Nitrogen deficiency produces an even yellowing across the entire leaf without spots. Blight needs fungicide and leaf removal. Nitrogen deficiency needs a side dress of balanced fertilizer. Wilting during the heat of the day, even though the soil is moist. This is a serious warning sign. If the plant recovers overnight and wilts again the next afternoon, you may be dealing with fusarium or verticillium wilt. These are vascular diseases caused by soil-borne fungi that physically block the water-conducting vessels inside the stem. There's no cure. Once it takes hold, prevention means choosing resistant varieties, those V and F codes on the seed packet, and rotating where you plant tomatoes each season. Flowers dropping off without setting fruit. Temperature is almost always the cause. Tomato pollen becomes non-viable above 90 degrees Fahrenheit and below about 55 degrees. If you're in a zone with extreme summer heat, shade cloth rated at 30 to 40% can keep temperatures around the flowers low enough for pollination. Timing your planting so that the heaviest fruit set happens before peak summer heat also helps. Fruit cracking or splitting. This happens when the plant takes up a sudden surge of water after a dry spell. The interior of the fruit expands faster than the skin can stretch, and it splits open. Consistent moisture is the prevention. If you know heavy rain is coming after a dry period, harvest any fruit that is close to ripe before the storm hits. Now, this is something I resisted for an embarrassingly long time, and it is the bonus tip I promised you. 3 to 4 inches of mulch around the base of every tomato plant applied the day you transplant. The science behind this is actually pretty simple, but it took me years to commit to it because I kept thinking it was optional. It is not. Mulch does 4 things simultaneously. It regulates soil moisture, which directly reduces blossom end rot. It suppresses rain splash that carries fungal spores to lower leaves. It moderates soil temperature swings, and as it breaks down, it feeds the soil biology that keeps your plants healthy. I use straw or shredded leaves. Avoid fresh wood chips right against the stem as they can hold too much moisture and invite rot. Spread. The mulch in a ring starting about 2 inches from the stem out to the drip line of the plant. I replenish once mid-season. When I finally tracked my disease incidents before and after committing to mulching, the difference was striking. Early blight infections dropped noticeably in the first season and stayed low every year after. It is the simplest change I have made in close to 15 years of gardening, and it had one of the biggest impacts. That is everything I have for you today. Gardening is one of those things where the more you learn, the more you realize there is to discover. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next video.